welcome to another episode of the Everyday Defender podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goosen. It's episode 9, and I'm joined as always by my friend from the Netherlands, Koos. How are you, sir?
Hey, Chris. How you doing? Howdy. We're approaching the end of the season, I think, already, right?
Yeah, well, look, we're getting there, and it's my most exciting time of the month is when I get to when I know that I'm going to be recording with you in the afternoon, and we're going through the prep and all of that type of stuff. It's a super exciting time. So really, really excited to be back again and talking to you today. Also, I should say congratulations. MVP renewals have just happened a few weeks ago.
That's
and
right.
Congrats for your renewal and continuing to be here. I think it's obviously very well deserved given all the great work you do in the community and elsewhere. So,
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it. And to you as well. And you finally got into the Dutch category, right?
Finally got into the Dutch category, security MVP. Yes, I'm very, very happy about that. It's been a lot of hard work over the last few years to get there. And unfortunately, the Dutch benefit hasn't kicked in just yet. But I hope any day now I'll wake up and be fluent in
People
Dutch.
shouldn't expect you handing out stroopwafels at the MVP Summit next year. Yet.
No, but I will consume stroopwafels as many as possible. So.
I'll help you out on that. I'll get you covered.
Before we get too sidetracked,
Tin Tams, right? Normally.
That's right. I always have Tin Tams at Summit. So before we get too carried away, today's episode, let's see what we've got. So I'm going to continue talking a little bit about Entra Suite and some components of Entra Suite, specifically the global secure access component. There's a lot to unpack there, and so I'm excited to kind of dig into that one a little deeper. And then, Koos, what have you got for us?
Yeah, I was working on a project recently for a customer where I got my hands on Defender for External Attack Surface Management, so EASM. And I know people at Microsoft call it EASMs, like Microsoft Defender for External Attack Surface Management. It's quite a mouthful.
It's a mouthful.
Say that 10 times fast, right? But it was really interesting. I knew about the product from more theoretical standpoint. It was great to get my hands on. And obviously that's why I thought it was a nice topic for today's episode, because I have some practical tips for the people who are listening. And I think people should really look into it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I can't wait to hear all about that. It's something I'm not super familiar with, so we'll get there. But if we continue our sort of Entra Suite journey from last episode, two of the components or two of the things that we talked about as part of Entra Suite was what we know as Microsoft Entra Private Access, and another component, which is Microsoft Entra Internet Access. And together, those things are often referred to as GSA or Global Secure Access, which is really the sort of Microsoft Zero Trust Network Access stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I love these products. I think these things are there's a lot of potential here. And I wanted to kind of dig into them just a little bit more to get folks sort of across sort of the nuances of it, right? There are some little nuances here. And again, it's going to be one of those things where, if you're a large, complex organization, chances are you're probably going to look at something like Zscaler for your internet access stuff anyway, and this isn't going to be for you. But I do think that there's a lot of potential here for some of the smaller orgs who are dipping their toe in the water there and wanting to start securing some of those internet access scenarios, or hybrid work from home type fleets where you've got a lot of assets that are all over the place. I think this is a really good solution for securing inbound and outbound, right? So on the one hand, we're replacing VPNs for that traditional connectivity back on prem, and then on the other hand, we're protecting our sort of internet access on connections and networks that we don't own, right? So if you think about grandma's house, where you've just got grandma's Wi-Fi and you're using your corporate asset connecting into M365 or any other SaaS application, being able to apply protection to that connection, and also maybe filter and block things that you don't want, your folks using your corporate assets to access, right? Think about gambling and stuff like that.
So Chris, before you continue, I'm a big noob on this topic. I hear the term SSE, Secure Service Edge, coming along quite a few times as well. Is that the old name for the product, or?
Yeah, that's an interesting. That is interesting. It is often referred to as SSE, and I actually think that when they first launched private access and internet access, they referred to it as SSE. I
Hmm.
think SSE is the capability. The Secure
Mm.
Service Edge is their capability, and GSA is really the product sort of category or name of the
Oh
product.
yeah,
That's at least how I understand it.
yeah. Okay.
That's a good question though, because I think there's a lot of terminology floating around everywhere,
Yeah,
and different
and
customers use different.
acronyms.
That's right. That's right. So a couple of things, I guess, from a requirements perspective for GSA. We talked about licensing. Licensing is always a thing, right? And so there's some nuances here. So number one, you're going to need an Entra ID P1 to begin with, right? And then once you have your the P1, you could either get just the private or the internet access license as an add-on, or you can get the Entra Suite license, which includes all those other things that we talked about in the last episode as well. So depending on which way you want to go, I think there's a lot of value in getting the Entra Suite licensing, but you're going to need the licensing. Now, there is one component that doesn't require licensing, and we'll get to that in just a second, but that's the first thing to know. Then secondly, you're going to need the GSA client installed on your clients for this, right? So one of the things that I found when I was sort of tinkering and messing around with this a little bit more deeply was that obviously the GSA client works just great if you're using Windows or a Mac, or if you have iOS and Android, but there's no Linux support. So don't think you're going to get you're going to be running your Debian or your Ubuntu Linux and installing the GSA client. That doesn't exist just at the moment. So I'm not sure what the plans are for that. And I think, Koos and I were talking earlier about this. For most organizations, probably not a big deal. I think it's
Yeah.
only the really hardcore geeky folks that are probably going to miss this, but something to be aware of, I guess, as well.
But the good thing, at least with private access, you can at least access into your Linux servers over the secure service edge, right?
Well, if you have a device inside your network that has the private connector installed, then yes, you can access those services. But that private connector, and this is the second thing, the private connector that you have to install will also only run on Windows.
Ah,
So
okay.
essentially, it's an outbound only. So if you think
Okay.
about having segmenting your applications and your services, you, instead of punching holes in your firewall for everything that you want to access, you have these
Mm.
connectors that you install that talk outbound to
Yeah.
the SSE. Once those connections are then made, the GSA client handles all the routing smarts and the policies that you set up to be able to access those applications. So you can make that work, but you're not going to be able to install the private network connector on a Linux machine or something that
Mm.
isn't Windows Server. So that's
Okay.
the other thing to be very much aware of there. Um,
Oh.
Another thing to think about is that your devices that you're going to use for this, they need to be known in some way, right? So they need to be either Entra joined or hybrid joined or sort of Intune managed or something like that. And that's for conditional policy, conditional access policy enforcement. So this kind of limits, those pure BYOD environments where you have these unknown clients. And we're going to talk a little bit later about something called Entra App Proxy, which is very similar. And if you've been around long enough, you probably have used or heard of Entra App Proxy, and that's where sort of App Proxy. This builds on App Proxy, but there are still some really good scenarios where App Proxy is probably the better tool, and I do want to dig into that a little bit in as we talk through this. So when we talk about GSA, we have this sort of concept of forwarding profiles or traffic forwarding profiles, and we're 3 profiles, right? And this is a really nice sort of interesting thing to kind of be aware of. So the first one is your Microsoft traffic profile, and the Microsoft traffic profile is available to you even if you don't have licenses for private or internet access. You don't need a specific or an additional license for it. So as long as you have either Business Premium or you have E3 or E5, the Microsoft traffic profile is actually included in those. And really what that does is it intercepts the traffic that is, specifically for Microsoft services, right? And I really like this because I think there's some benefit here. So for one of the things you can be doing is you can be applying those conditional access policies to folks that are actually accessing those Microsoft services from your corporate devices. But more importantly, what you can do is you can combine this with something called UTR, which is Universal Tenant Restrictions, to actually start locking down the types of tenants or the tenants that your clients can connect to. And if you think about one of the gaps in it has always been, from an exfil perspective, is if someone were to sort of compromise a device in your fleet, on your network, right, and your firewall allows access to star.microsoft.com or star.office.com or one of those things. Well, an easy way for them to exfil data is to just go to another tenant, right? Log into a different tenant. It's still Microsoft's environment, which your firewall, which doesn't really, isn't really inspecting the stuff, is allowing. Well, when you combine this with UTR, you can now start locking down what tenants your clients are actually allowed to connect to. So I think there's some real power there, especially if you have some really sort of lockdown environments where you maybe have I don't know, a dev tenant or and a production tenant, and you only want those two tenants to be accessed from your devices, no other tenants. So some really powerful stuff, and that's the Microsoft Traffic Profile. Just it's part of the product, and there's no additional licensing, so you can play with this and the GSA client sort of now without additional licensing, right? The next profile to talk about is the private access profile, and private access, as you would expect, is really as a way to provide access to apps and systems and things that you own within your data center, right? So think about traditionally you have a VPN client installed on your machines. Once they fire up, the user fires up the VPN, they land on a subnet that typically then allows them to access, whatever that subnet is open to, right? It could be one app, it could be 10 apps that are all on that subnet. And that's how folks work. And folks still work like that today. I mean, this is not, that uncommon. It's a pretty common scenario. Yeah. So what private access does, it allows you to actually grant access to applications like that, well, without the use of a VPN, but doing it on a per app basis as well, right? So you can register these apps individually within your tenant, and you can provide and apply conditional access to these applications specifically as a workflow to your tenant. So really, really powerful stuff. The great thing about it is it supports sort of all TCP and UDP protocols. So you can do IDP across this. You can do SSH across this. You can do SSH across this if you're not SSHing to a Linux server. Okay. That is a scenario that I myself have tried. Obviously, you can't install. You cannot install the client onto the Linux server, so it doesn't work so well. But I'm sure there are ways to get around it. But
and it will probably follow soon in the future, right?
I would imagine. Now, the thing is that the private network connector, it's been around for a long time because it's actually part of what used to be called Azure App Proxy, was now called Entra App Proxy, right? So it's the same concept as you installing the client on a Windows server, it's connecting out and making. It's been around. I mean, I think that thing supports anything from Server 2012 onwards, right? So it's been around for a little while. They've never done anything to make it sort of, Linux compatible. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure you don't need to have. You could probably SSH to, if you had a Windows server with that running, you could probably have a Linux server that has that's on the same subnet that you connect to. I'm sure there will be ways to make that work. So, but like I said, be aware of that, right?
Yeah, good to know.
So we talk about app proxy a fair bit, and really private access is that sort of evolution of what Entra App Proxy is and was. But app proxy isn't dead, because there are things and there are scenarios where you may actually still want to use app proxy instead of private access, right? So app proxy works really well with web apps and HTTP, HTTPS applications, especially when you're wanting to do some sort of authentication on the connection. So imagine you have a web server or a web application of some sort. The web app itself doesn't have any authentication, but you want to publish that to the internet. Well, app proxy is really good for this, because you can actually then handle all the authentication through Entra,
Yeah.
If a user if the user is assigned to the app and they have an Entra login, you can then multi-factor them. You can do all that cool stuff in Entra before passing the connection through to the app. So for those web scenarios, especially where you have unknown devices, BYOD devices that are not known to you at all, app proxy still works really, really well, right?
Yeah, I don't see it being used that often, to my surprise.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And and again, it's been around for a long time. I mean,
Yeah, true.
when I've been digging through my lab recently with stuff, and I still had an app proxy connector group from 2016 where
Yeah, yeah.
I had published ADFS in that way, right? Back when ADFS was still a thing. Remember that? So
Well, it is still a thing. Spoiler alert for a lot of customers, but yeah, they're using
yes.
it probably not in the correct way.
So I think the takeaway here is that, and I've put a table in the show notes here for anyone who wants to kind of see a quick reference of this. Is like, when should you use app proxy? When should you use private access? I think the takeaway really is that private access is good when you're using something that isn't HTTP or HTTPS, right? Or
Yeah,
if you want that VPN replacement, and you're going to handle all your authentication stuff via the global secure client, then that's where you want to use private access. But if you've got those unknown scenarios, maybe you've got some B2B scenarios or legacy web app stuff, Entra App Proxy still works and is alive and well for you, and it's configured in a very similar way. So there shouldn't be too much drama
yeah.
for you there.
Chris, how does licensing work for Entra App Proxy? I'm not familiar with that, to be honest.
Oh, that's a good question, actually. I don't think it doesn't require the additional licenses that you need
For private
for
access.
for private access. So it doesn't
Yeah,
require the Entra Suite stuff. I believe it's included just with P1 or
yeah,
P2 licenses. So I think if you have a P1, which is the same as the Microsoft traffic profile, so just a Entra ID P1, which
yeah,
is included with E3 and E5s, right? So there's a lot of
yeah,
good value there, and that
yeah,
would do it for you. Um,
yeah.
so the last of the traffic profiles, and this one's pretty simple, right? Is internet access. So think about, we were talking about private access, which is granting access to applications that you own in your data center. Well, internet access is kind of the other way around. Is granting access to applications that maybe you still own it. Maybe it's a SaaS application, but that application is actually in the cloud. So you're connecting outbound. Now, historically, you would have some sort of proxy server on your web proxy on your premises, or in your office. Your connections go through that and get proxied outbound. Well, with the work from home scenarios these days, that doesn't really happen all that much anymore. And we've obviously mentioned scenarios like Zscaler, right, which kind of handles this type of thing really, really well. But that's really what this is. It's sort of that web secure web gateway, if you will, for accessing public services and public SaaS applications. Again, being able to enforce conditional access on those connections. So making sure that if someone's going to access your M365 environment, you want to make sure that they're using maybe an Intune enrolled device or a known device, or that type of conditional access and granular control on those outbounds. But you can also do things like web content filtering, right? And I'll say this is really, really basic stuff, but if maybe your environment, you just want to filter really basic stuff. You want to filter Facebook and ChatGPT and whatever else you don't want your users to be using. You can do that quite easily with this. That's what it's made for, right? So you can do sort of filtering by category or by FQDN on this. The categories, I think, are pretty limited.
Yeah.
But it will give you a basic level of web content filtering if that's what you're looking for. And that's a good way to protect your assets if someone has one of your devices and they're using an internet cafe or their home connection or something. At least you can provide some control, right?
Yeah.
So really, that's kind of one of the needs here is to be able to enforce that really good control on the outbound connections, bit of filtering, and then there's some additional benefits as far as being able to tell the true source of the IP address from a logging perspective. So you're not looking in the logs and seeing only a single proxy server IP address, right, on your connections. You can actually tell where the connections are coming from that using the source IP restoration stuff. So again, this is probably not going to be a solution for every single customer. But I'm a strong believer that there are a lot of customers that will actually see some really good benefit from this. And even if, remember, we talk about this all the time, that in our sort of security world, things have to be iterative, right? You got to constantly kind of mature your offerings, and even if this isn't your final long term solution, this may be a really good stepping stone solution for you to just get
Yeah.
into the habit of like, how do we monitor and restrict our outbound access? Well, here's a good place to start before you start looking into other bigger tools for the job. So definitely worth checking out. There is a trial available as well. So as with a lot of things in sort of the M365 ecosystem, if you just want to just kick the tires on this, you can sign up for a 25 user trial. I think it's for like 1 month.
Mm-hmm.
And then interestingly, what I've noticed with the trial workflow, especially on this one, is you actually get the option of once the trial ends, actually subscribing or just letting it die, which is great. I had not seen that before in the Microsoft billing engine, which, as we know, can be quite complex. So yeah, very, very cool stuff. I definitely think it's worth taking a look at.
Yeah, and a lot of development is going into this product. Probably a lot of additional features will be added to it in the future. Do you know, Chris? Because last time I looked at that at the internet access part, I was actually looking for a way to redirect internet traffic for a group of people over a very fixed outbound IP address. Do you know if that is possible by now? It wasn't back then, but can I
So
do this?
instead of doing it by individual users, you want to direct it or do it from a
Yeah, for
network
example,
connection.
if a service requires me coming in from a set IP address, for example, some companies and I work for an MSSP, and we have a lot of companies still wanting to limit our access into their environment coming from a set IP address, for example. And you can
Yeah,
do that
that's
with a
good.
VPN client,
Yeah,
VPN box. But I'm not. So I was kind of hoping that private access would able to provide me this somewhere in the future.
I don't know that it. I mean, you could probably do it using what they call remote networks. So
Mm-hmm.
if you set up a remote network, you could probably do it that way. It will cut, all the everything that flows through that network path comes from a known IP. But no, that's not a scenario that I've come across. So
No,
that's
that's okay.
interesting. Yeah,
Just
interesting.
curious. Yeah.
Lastly, I think just a quick worth mentioning, and I have put it in the notes as well, is, and I literally learned about this like 2 days ago. There's a preview currently of something called private access for domain controllers, and it's like I said, it's in preview, and essentially what it is, it builds on private access and allows you now to layer in applications that use sort of legacy Kerberos environments, right? So
Mm.
if you think about things that today would still need to use a domain controller for authentication, well, you don't want to be putting your domain controllers on the internet, and you certainly don't
No.
want to be, opening those things up. This is now a way where you can install a private access sensor on the domain controllers, and then using SPN configurations, you can actually now enforce things like multi-factor auth and all sorts of conditional access on those legacy Kerberos applications. This looks really promising. I've not messed with it yet because it's pretty new. But like I said, this was kind of announced very, very recently and is currently in preview. So, if you're in your environment still have some legacy, so Kerberos type applications, this might be something that you want to look at as well. So check that out. Koos, over to you to talk about
Sounds good.
the very, very big mouthful, Defender for External Attack Surface Management.
Yes, let's call it MDEASM, but that's still a mouthful as an acronym, right? So
Yes, it is.
I'll try not to fumble over my words in the next couple of 10, 15 minutes too much. Yeah, so Defender for External Attack Surface Management is a tool designed to help organizations discover, monitor, and secure everything that's internet facing. So, and most important part of this is even the ones they didn't know existed. So you have to think of this as some kind of automated reconnaissance tool. You just fill in your domain names, your IP blocks, your ASNs, who is information, that kind of stuff. And Microsoft will automatically crawl across all of those assets and try to find other linked assets to it. And then once it has built an entire inventory, it will also do a lot of port scanning stuff and finding out what kind of services are behind those IP addresses, if maybe there are some certificate issues, maybe some potential exploits available on certain services, and it will all give you those insights for your entire publicly facing attack surface, so to speak. So, and I think companies grow larger, they acquire other companies, they move to the cloud, spin up new environments. Their attack surface becomes so much harder to track what they all have running over there and what they actually have. And I think that's why this is really key to get back the visibility of all the stuff you're actually handing out to the public internet. So again, I used a large online retailer in the Netherlands on board this, so they have a lot of public-facing assets because they have web shops and all kinds of other internet services running. So was kind of amazed to see how much EASM was able to discover purely by just entering initially their primary domain name. So what it will do, it will also pull in Whois information. For example, if your email address is the contact name for that domain, it will also look up for Whois information on that same email address to find other domains you might have registered, which might be related to that one. So you just initially create a what they call a discovery group, and within a discovery group you can, well, like I said earlier, add domains, IP blocks, ASNs, Whois information, a lot of stuff. You don't need, not everything is required. You can just start with a domain name, for example. And then periodically, a default is a week, I believe, it will scan and try to find new assets. I was already confronted with a lot of assets not being owned by this company. So this company had a certain domain name, but that same domain name with a .br for Brazil was apparently a news site in Brazil. And Microsoft thought it was related because it had the same domain name, right? But then with a different extension at the end of it. So you really have to regularly check what kind of assets Microsoft is discovering, because you pay per asset. So even if you fill in a single domain name, if Microsoft will discover 100 domains and 20 IP addresses, you pay for the 120 assets discovered. And you pay 10 cents per asset per day. And this might not sound like much, but if a company like this retailer ended up with, I believe, 3,000 something assets, then it quickly adds up, of course. So, and that's also why you need to keep an eye on it after you set it up to make sure that everything that is discovered incorrectly or is not related, you have to exclude yourself in the device group. And Microsoft will also discover assets with a state they call requires investigation. And until you acknowledge that this is indeed your asset, they will not do any scanning on it or incorporating it into the dashboard. So you really have to go in and say, okay, this is mine or this is not mine. So there's a little bit of work initially to get it started, but it's not too bad, I believe, especially with everything that's discovered automatically. It is a bit weird. Microsoft is nowadays putting all the Defender stuff in the security portal, right? Even Sentinel is now there. And Microsoft even recently did an announcement that they will stop Sentinel from being an Azure resource 1 year from now. So they're now really forcing everything in the security portal. But Defender for external attack surface management is still a Azure resource. So I think this is maybe the last one or something, I don't know. Right. So you have to deploy it through the Azure portal, but once the instance is set up, you can connect it to your Defender XDR by going into the security portal. I've put it in the show notes where you have exactly where you should go exactly, because it's a little bit hidden, to be honest. But there you can select the instance you've deployed in Azure, and then the insights and recommendations will show up there as well. But the initial setup and configuration is still done all in Azure. Well, I was also happy to see that there's log analytics integration by default, which obviously makes it very useful to connect into Sentinel. Microsoft does not have any content available for Sentinel. I was kind of surprised to see that. So they don't have any Content Hub package or any detections or whatnot. So actually, I had to create a couple of my own, and I shared these in the show notes as well. So I think it's very useful to trigger a security incident in Sentinel, for example, if EASM discovers an asset with a high critical vulnerability, for example. You want to know about that. And then you can imagine that people are not looking in the dashboards every day constantly. So you want to pop up an incident. You can do that. Unfortunately, I discovered that the new assets discovered which require investigation could not be triggered in Sentinel, and this is due to the fact that the state the state property of an asset is for some reason not synced to log analytics right now. So I'm already in touch with the engineering team behind the product, and I filed a feature request. So I'm hoping that they will add that in the future. Your external attack surface is not changing that frequently, I can imagine. But it is something to keep in mind. But
it's an interesting concept though, because if you do an external pen test of your environment, like one of the things I guess that most pen testers are going to use is they're going to start looking at certificate revocation lists and certificate logs and all these types of things to find where you've maybe generated services over the years, right? Because like especially those like CRT logs, those things don't go away, and you can see any certificate that was ever generated for a domain, and there may be a service there. So I'm sure there's, for many organizations doing this, there's going to be that sort of initial shock of like, oh, I forgot about that. Or we didn't realize that this was still there. We thought this was gone a long time ago, right? Because no one ever cleans up everything perfectly all the time.
No, that's true. And initially I was kind of surprised that when I set it up in my lab environment, I was able to add any domain I wanted. And I was like, shouldn't I prove that this domain is mine? And then I was like, no, of course not. This is all public information, right? And an attacker can also scan those domains and look for open ports and whatnot. So it's fine. You can add everything you want.
Except if you use this, you're going to be paying 10 cents for everyone you scan.
Yes,
which I guess is probably a little bit of a deterrent for someone versus the Python script that they downloaded off GitHub that's doing the same thing for them, right? So.
Yeah, that's true. And also for people listening, you can, when you deploy your first EASM instance, it automatically activates a 30-day trial. So you can add your environment, see what comes up. And well, if you don't think it's useful, you just remove the instance and you're not charged anything. To keep a track on cost, I also created a detection in Sentinel for this customer to alert when new assets were found and the total amount increased more than 10%, because you can imagine the discovery will rerun weekly, and it might eventually discover assets who are yours or maybe not. And then, like the example with the Brazilian website, if it suddenly discovers a completely new domain with a lot of assets, you will pay for them at the end of the month, and you want to know up front, right? So that's why I created the detection to periodically, on a weekly basis, compare the amount of assets with last week. And if there's a more than 10% increase, you get a security incident in Sentinel, and then you know that you have to look for something perhaps to either clean up or just accept the fact that you had more assets now. But at least now you know. There's nothing like this in the product, but you can build solutions like this through log analytics.
Oh, that's very nice. I'm sure that's going to be very helpful for folks. But yeah, this sounds really cool. This sounds like something I want to mess around with pretty soon. I like the idea.
Yeah, and it's really cool when you see all the domains and IP addresses pop up. You can, for example, this customer also had a VPN endpoint with a VPN specific name, DNS name, of course. And when you click on it, you can see what kind of services they're running. They're running a Cisco service. So Microsoft is already warning me about potential exploits with outdated firmware versions. They were not able to check that over the open port, but since they know it was Cisco Firepower, for example, I believe, then they know, okay, there are known vulnerabilities. Please check that you have your firmware up to this version. Really useful stuff, really informational stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. and Cisco, I think, have had a couple of pretty nasty ones over the last month or so. So yeah, that's a particular instance too. Very nice,
Yeah,
Koos. That's awesome.
and this customer had their had their firmwares in check, so they were able to acknowledge the alert coming in EASM and close it down and make sure that acknowledges that they saw that and they are up to date already. But at least now you know, right? And
Yeah,
like you said, a lot of stuff you don't know still existed and was probably outdated and vulnerable for attacks. So
yeah,
I think especially when you're running publicly facing assets,
mm,
you really should look into this, my
yeah.
opinion.
No, 100%. Very cool. It's very, very, very nice. Thank you for that one.
Yeah.
I think before we wrap up, just to talk about our community project for this month. This is an interesting one, and it's interesting because the person who's come up with this, and I'm probably gonna butcher the name here, but I'm gonna give him my best shot anyway. Mikhail Carson, or Carlson, created this tool called Intune Management, and
Don't
it's
repeat yourself, Chris. You're making it worse. You just stick to the initial pronunciation. Sorry for
um,
interrupting you, man.
and he created this PowerShell tool called Intune Management, which is essentially like a user interface onto Intune. Now, the reason this is interesting is because I don't know Mikhail, and he's from Sydney, or at least he lives in Sydney as well. And I don't know him, and he doesn't appear to be an MVP or anything like that. It's just a cool tool that he created randomly that I came across, and I really like the look of this. It looks very, very cool. And one of the reasons, I think where I see the real benefit to this is it allows you to sort of copy and export, import, export, delete policies and profile information within
Ooh.
Intune and Azure. And it's got a ton of sort of options as far as your app protection policies or your app configuration policies and compliance policies, conditional access, all that stuff that you configure either in Azure or in Intune. It gives you an interface to obviously view and edit those things, but also then if you wanted to clone or back up those policies, which firstly I think is really cool to be able to have that like a backup of your policies in a way that you can very easily import them, right? I think that in itself is of great benefit. But I could also see this working really well for folks like myself who are consultants who, you probably have a base of policies that maybe you build that, is mostly the same for every customer, right? Like, most customers have Apple and iOS and Android devices, and they have some sort of compliance policies or configuration policies for that. And if you had a baseline set of policies that you could then build and export and then re-import those into a different environment, that's really powerful instead of having to either orchestrate them or recreate them from scratch. So
Yeah.
the tool works great. I ran it up on a it only works on Windows. I'll say that because I think it says WPF, but I'm sure there's a little bit of Windows Forms and stuff in there as well.
Yeah.
So the GUI anyway will only run on Windows. But I had to play with it earlier this morning, and it's very cool. It's very sort of functional, I think, and it's been around for a while. I think the first commits on GitHub were like 4 years ago, so
Oh,
he's been
really?
working on this for a while. And then there was some updates recently, just a couple of months ago. So it's great work, Mikhail. If you're interested in checking this out, there's a link to the GitHub repo in the show notes. And if you work in Intune a lot, or you work with devices and autopilot stuff like that, this might make your life easier. So
Yeah.
go check it out.
Thanks for sharing, Chris. Good find.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think with that, it's probably time to wrap up and say goodbye. Koos, I'm sure you've got a day job to get to today.
Yes. It's 9 o'clock in
And
the morning now. Time to start my day.
absolutely, yes, I'm going to kick back here now. I think it's time for me to go watch some Tour de France highlights.
What are you going to watch?
The Tour de France highlights from the stage. Well, it would be stage 15, I guess. Highlights because of the
Okay.
time zone. I get to I watch the highlights in my afternoon. So the stage. I mean, the stage runs overnight, right? I think they start
Yeah.
around 8 o'clock p.m. Sydney time. But I'm not going to stay up and watch as much as I love the Tour de France. I can't stay up and watch a 6-hour stage. So I watch the highlights the next afternoon before the next stage kicks off. It's just kind of my
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Enjoy the
yeah.
cycling highlights and see you next time.
Absolutely. We'll see you again. Thanks everyone for listening. Please feel free to like and subscribe, or reach out to us on the socials as well. We have a LinkedIn page now also.
That's
So if
true.
you
Yeah.
yeah, if you want to reach out to us with some, if you have feedback, or if there's something that specifically that you want us to cover on the show, please reach out to us, and we'll do our best to accommodate that. But until then, we'll see you for episode 10, and we will be back in a month. So until then,
Thanks
take
for
care
listening.
and see you.
Bye bye.